I've always been the kind of person who goes camping specifically to get away from people. You know, back in early October of 2022, I decided to do a solo weekend trip up into the high country of Colorado. I was looking for absolute, total isolation. So I hiked about 5 miles off the main designated trails to reach this unnamed alpine lake, sitting at around 11,000 feet. If you've never been to an alpine lake at that elevation, the environment is almost alien. There are no thick forests right at the water's edge, just jagged scree fields and loose gravel banks. By the time I reached the water, the wind had died down completely. The surface of the lake was perfectly still. I pitched my tent right on the gravel bank, maybe 10 feet from the water, and just sat back to watch the sunset. Once the sun dips below the peaks up there, the temperature dropped sharply. It went from a comfortable 60 degrees to near freezing in a matter of an hour. As the sky turned pitch black, the perfectly still water essentially turned into a massive dark mirror, flawlessly reflecting the starlight and the black outlines of the surrounding mountains. Around 8 p.m., I was sitting by a tiny modest campfire, quietly eating a dehydrated chili mac meal right out of the pouch. The silence up there was so heavy, it almost made my ears ring. Then, I heard it. Plop. It was the distinct, heavy sound of a large rock hitting the water, coming from the opposite shoreline about 100 yards away. It echoed sharply across the quiet valley. I paused, my spoon halfway to my mouth, and just listened. My immediate thought was that it was a natural rockfall. The steep, loose rock fields on the other side of the lake shift all the time, especially when the temperature drops rapidly and the moisture freezes. I brushed it off and took a bite of my food. 30 seconds later, plop. Then another 30 seconds, plop. I stopped chewing. A small knot of unease started to form in my stomach. The splashes were way too deliberate to be falling debris. It didn't sound like a cascade of loose pebbles sliding down a hill. It sounded exactly like someone methodically tossing baseball-sized stones into the freezing water at a steady rhythmic pace. I stood up, the gravel crunching loudly under my boots. I figured another hiker must have arrived late in the dark and was setting up camp on the opposite bank. "Hey, anyone over there?" I called out, my voice booming across the open water. I waited for a hello or a flashlight to flick on, but there was absolutely no verbal response. The forest and the rocks were dead silent. Instead of answering me, the unseen person threw another heavy rock. Ka-thunk. This one was thrown much harder. The ripples rolled all the way across the glass-like water, gently lapping against the toes of my boots. My heart started racing. Sitting by a campfire in the pitch black feels comforting, until you realize that you can't see anything past the glow of the flames, but anyone out in the dark can see you perfectly. I felt incredibly exposed, frustrated, and with my adrenaline starting to spike, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my tactical flashlight. It's an incredibly bright LED beam meant for spotting wildlife. I clicked it on and swept the blinding beam of light directly across the 100-yard expanse of black water, illuminating the gravel bank on the far side. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. Standing right on the edge of the water was a man. He was wearing dark, filthy clothes that looked way too thin for the freezing weather. But the terrifying part wasn't just that he was standing there in the dark. It was how he was standing. He was perfectly still, but he wasn't looking across the lake at me. He wasn't even shielding his eyes or reacting to the blinding flashlight beam hitting him straight on. His neck was craned sharply downward at an uncomfortable, unnatural angle. He was staring with intense, unblinking focus, straight down into the water. It took my brain a couple of agonizing seconds to process what I was looking at. Because the lake was a perfect mirror, he wasn't looking at the water itself. He was staring exclusively at my reflection on the surface of the lake. A wave of pure dread washed over me. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my chest. To test what I was seeing, keeping the flashlight steady with my left hand, I slowly raised my right hand and gave a slight, hesitant wave. Across the lake, the man didn't look up. He didn't turn his head. Instead, he simply lifted a large, jagged rock he was holding and dropped it straight down into the shallows. It smashed perfectly onto the reflection of my waving hand, shattering my mirrored image into a chaotic mess of ripples. I couldn't breathe. I literally could not move my feet. I watched in absolute horror as the ripples slowly settled, and the reflection of my body reformed on the black water. Once the water was perfectly still again, the stranger took a slow, deliberate step forward into the freezing alpine lake. The water must have been 35 degrees, but he didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He just took a step, then another. He was wading into the lake, his eyes still locked rigidly downward, walking toward my upside-down image as if the reflection was the actual physical target he was trying to reach. The sheer, psychotic irrationality of his behavior broke whatever paralysis had a hold on me. I immediately kicked a massive pile of dirt and gravel over my fire, plunging my side of the lake into darkness. I didn't pack my tent. I didn't grab my stove, my sleeping bag, or my expensive backpack. I just kept my flashlight in my hand, grabbed my car keys from my pocket, and bolted for the trail. I took the dangerous, rocky hike down the steep mountain trail in the pitch black, slipping and tearing my hands up on sharp rocks, driven by pure panic. I kept expecting to hear wet footsteps running up the trail behind me, but I never stopped to look back. It took me almost 3 hours of blind, adrenaline-fueled hiking to finally reach the deserted dirt parking lot at the trailhead. By the time I saw the reflective paint of my Subaru, my legs were shaking so violently I could barely stand. I was physically battered, bleeding, and gasping for air, but I felt this massive, overwhelming wave of relief that I had escaped the mountain. The temperature had dropped well below freezing down at the trailhead, covering my car's windows in a thick layer of icy condensation. I stumbled up to the driver's side door, practically sobbing with relief as I hit the unlock button on my key fob. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. The air completely left my lungs. Traced clearly into the thick, freezing condensation on my driver's side window was the word drown. It was written backward, traced from the outside, so that it could only be read clearly in the glass's reflection. I drove away that night and never looked back, leaving everything I owned on that mountain. I never contacted the rangers, and I never went back to retrieve my gear. To this day, my tent and sleeping bag are likely still rotting on that gravel bank, unless someone or something decided to use them. I've been solo camping for about 5 years now, mostly around the Pacific Northwest. But back in November of 2021, I decided to switch things up. I drove out to the high plains of eastern Washington. If you've never been out that way, it's basically just endless fields of dead grass, old dirt access roads, and abandoned farming plots stretching out for miles. I parked my truck off a cracked gravel road and hiked maybe 2 miles into this massive, overgrown field. By the time the sun started going down, the wind was just brutal. You know that bitter, freezing kind of wind that cuts right through your jacket and makes your eyes water? Yeah, that kind. There were absolutely no trees to block it, so I started looking for any kind of shelter to pitch my tent behind. That's when I found it, the grain silo. It was this old corrugated steel cylinder, completely rusted out, with the roof long gone. One side had a wide, doorless opening where the metal had either been ripped away or just rotted off. I stepped inside and instantly, the wind just died down. It felt like a perfect little metal fortress. I didn't even bother setting up my tent. I just threw a tarp over the dirt floor, rolled out my sleeping bag, and set up my small battery-powered lantern. It was actually surprisingly cozy. I ate a protein bar, read on my phone for a bit, and fell asleep around 10 p.m. I woke up at exactly 2:14 a.m. I know the exact time because grabbing my phone was the very first thing I did. The wind had stopped completely. It was dead silent outside, but that wasn't what woke me up. Tap, tap, tap. It was this polite, rhythmic tapping echoing against the outside of the steel wall. At first, my groggy brain tried to rationalize it. I figured maybe it's a loose branch blowing against the metal, or a coyote scratching at the rust. I zipped my sleeping bag up a little higher and tried to just ignore it, but the cadence was too perfect. It was like a metronome, and then it started moving. The tapping slowly shifted to the right, keeping that exact same rhythm. Tap, step, tap, step. It was slowly circling the perimeter of the silo. My heart started picking up speed. I sat up in my sleeping bag, the freezing air hitting my face, and just listened. As the sound moved, it started getting heavier. It shifted from a light tap to a dense, hollow clang. The metal actually vibrated. Soon the impacts were so heavy, I could feel the thuds transferring through the frozen dirt, right into my sleeping mat. Whoever, or whatever was out there, was hitting the wall with real force now. I realized that lying on the ground in the pitch dark was the worst possible thing I could do. I needed to see what was out there. There was an old, crumbling cinder block resting near my bag. I slowly, silently, crept out of my sleeping bag. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep my balance as I stepped up onto the block to peer over the 8-foot rusted rim of the silo. I fully expected to see someone aggressively trying to break their way inside, maybe a drifter, or some tweaked-out local who thought I was on their turf. Instead, my stomach just dropped. I looked over the jagged metal edge and saw a man, standing perfectly still in the moonlight. He was facing the exterior wall, maybe 3 feet away from it. He was gripping a large, jagged rock in his right hand. The rock, and his bare hands, were heavily stained with dark, wet blood. But the most disturbing part was his face. He wasn't looking at the silo. His neck was craned back at this unnatural, painful-looking angle, staring completely blankly, straight up into the pitch-black sky. With zero emotion, zero hesitation, he swung the rock forward, smashing it into the corrugated steel. Clang. He stood there for 2 seconds, then took a single step to his right. Clang. The sheer irrationality of it completely broke my brain. I froze. But what sent pure ice through my veins was the realization that the wide-open, doorless entrance to the silo was barely 10 feet to his left. He made absolutely no attempt to go toward it. He was acting as if the entrance didn't even exist. I dropped back down to the dirt floor instantly, pressing my back against the cold steel. I couldn't breathe. The illusion of my metal fortress vanished. I was in a cage. There was only one way out, and this absolute lunatic was pacing right outside of it. For the next 3 hours, I lay completely motionless on my sleeping pad. I didn't reach for my phone to call 911. I was terrified the screen's light would reflect off the metal walls, or the sound of me whispering would alert him to the open doorway. I just laid there in the freezing dark, listening to the deafening, rhythmic smashing circle my camp. Asterisk clang, step. Clang, step. Asterisk every single time his heavy, dragging footsteps crunched through the dead grass and past the open doorway. I literally stopped breathing. My lungs burned. The adrenaline made my entire body violently shiver. I kept waiting for the clanging to stop, waiting for a head to suddenly poke around the metal frame and look inside. But he never broke his pattern. He just walked right past the opening, striking the exterior wall again and again. Around 5:30 a.m., the sky finally began to turn a dull, grayish blue. Suddenly, mid-stride, the hitting just stopped. There was a dull thud, like he dropped the rock in the grass, and then the faint sound of footsteps walking away until they faded completely into the morning wind. I waited another 45 agonizing minutes before I found the courage to stand up. I didn't pack my sleeping bag. I didn't grab my lantern. I just snatched my truck keys, scrambled out of the silo opening, and sprinted through the overgrown field. I didn't see anyone around, but I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. As I unlocked the door and threw myself into the driver's seat, I took one last look back at the silo standing alone in the field. In the daylight, I could finally see the full extent of what he'd been doing. The entire exterior circumference of the silo, about chest high, was covered in thousands of overlapping, blood-smeared dents. He hadn't just been circling me for those 3 hours. Based on the sheer number of dents wrapping around the rusted steel, He had been out there mindlessly hitting that wall, long before I ever woke up. I've always preferred off-trail camping. There's just something about the complete isolation of the backcountry that you can't get at established campsites. Back in late November of 2019, I decided to spend a few days deep in the Appalachian Mountains, well off the main trails. I just wanted to completely disconnect for a while. The temperatures were supposed to drop near freezing that weekend, so I brought a heavy-duty winter mummy bag as a spare, just in case my standard quilt wasn't enough. I found a perfect spot late in the afternoon, a small natural clearing tucked between two massive ancient oak trees. I set up my hammock and pulled a rain tarp tightly over the top. Since I was in bear country, I strapped my heavy hiking pack directly to the trunk of the oak tree right near my feet, keeping it elevated and secure. My spare sleeping bag was strapped tightly to the bottom loops of the pack. I made a quick dinner, hung my food bag away from camp, and climbed into my hammock as the sun went down. The forest was dead quiet. I fell asleep pretty easily, just listening to the absolute stillness of the woods. But then, I woke up shivering. It was that deep, biting cold that seeps right into your bones. I checked my phone. It was 12:15 a.m. The temperature must have dropped way faster than I expected. I didn't want to get out of my warm spot, so I just unzipped the bug net a few inches and reached down in the pitch black. I was feeling around the base of my backpack for the spare winter bag, but my fingers just brushed against the nylon straps. That was it, just the straps. I frowned in the dark, feeling around a bit more. The bulky sleeping bag wasn't there. My fingers traced the straps and found the plastic buckles. They were perfectly unclipped. I froze. My initial groggy thought was that a desperate raccoon or a black bear had yanked it down and dragged it off while I was asleep. But animals don't unclip heavy-duty buckles. They tear them. A small knot of unease formed in my stomach. I clicked on my headlamp, sending a bright beam of light cutting through the freezing air. I signed it down at my pack, then scanned the surrounding brush, expecting to see shredded green nylon scattered in the dirt. But there was nothing. The forest floor was completely empty, and it was unnervingly silent. You know how the woods usually have some kind of ambient noise? Wind in the bare branches, distant water, something. But there was absolute dead silence. Then the silence broke. It was a heavy, wet, dragging sound, slowly pushing through the dry, frozen leaves. It was coming from the thick brush just beyond the reach of my headlamp. It was moving impossibly slow, inching its way forward. My breath hitched in my throat. I turned my headlamp toward the noise, but the angle of the tarp and the steep curve of my hammock blocked my line of sight. I listened, completely frozen, as the dragging sound moved right into my campsite. It wasn't the heavy, erratic thud of a bear. It was a deliberate, sliding pull. It moved directly underneath my suspended body and stopped. My heart started hammering, so hard I thought it was gonna break my ribs. I couldn't breathe. If you've ever slept in a hammock, you know how physically restricting it is. The fabric cocoons around you, pulling your shoulders in. You're basically trapped in a suspended sack, 3 feet off the ground, completely blind to whatever is directly beneath your spine. I lay there paralyzed, holding my breath. I could feel the cold radiating up through the thin nylon, mixed with the terrifying awareness that something was inches beneath me. I desperately wanted to stay still and hope it went away, but the dread of not knowing was suffocating me. Moving by fractions of an inch, I slowly shifted my weight to the side. The hammock fabric strained and creaked, a sound that felt deafening in the silence. I leaned my upper body over the precarious edge, pointing my headlamp straight down. It wasn't a scavenging animal. Lying in the dirt, directly beneath me, was my stolen green mummy bag. But it was fully zipped up, bulging and stretched tight. And in the tiny cinched breathing hole at the top of the bag, illuminated by my headlamp, was a grown man's face. He was staring straight up at me. His eyes were impossibly wide, unblinking, tracking my every movement. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me with this blank, terrifying intensity. Before I could even process the horror of what I was looking at, the man violently convulsed. He started wriggling and thrashing his bound body against the freezing dirt, arching his back and violently throwing himself upward. He was hitting the underside of my hammock, jolting me into the air like some massive, deranged caterpillar trying to break me out of a cocoon. Pure, blinding adrenaline took over. I panicked, throwing my entire body weight to the side. The hammock flipped, dumping me blindly into the freezing dirt. I hit the ground hard, scrambling to my feet. I didn't grab my shoes. I didn't grab my keys. I just sprinted barefoot into the pitch-black woods. I ran blindly through thorny brush and dead branches, feeling the skin on my feet tearing open against the rocks. I didn't stop, and I never once looked back. I just ran toward where I knew the main trail was, eventually finding a gravel logging road miles away around dawn, where a passing forestry truck finally spotted me. I sat in the heated cab of the truck, bleeding and shivering uncontrollably, trying to explain to the rangers what had happened. They drove me back to the general area, and a couple of armed rangers hiked in to clear the site. When they escorted me back to my camp a few hours later, the clearing looked almost perfectly normal. My hammock was still there, hanging between the oaks. My heavy pack was still strapped securely to the tree trunk, but the stolen sleeping bag wasn't on the ground anymore. It was propped up, resting neatly against the trunk of a nearby tree, fully zipped to the top. One of the rangers cautiously approached it, his hand resting on his holster, and slowly unzipped the front. The man was gone, but the sleeping bag wasn't empty. It was stuffed completely solid, packed to the brim with masses of freshly cut human hair. I still have absolutely no idea whose it was, or what that man was doing out there, but I've never gone camping again. Those are today's 3 stories. Honestly, the part that haunts me most is that sleeping bag stuffed with human hair. It's absolutely bone-chilling. If you've ever had a similar encounter in the great outdoors, feel free to share it in the comments. If you enjoy these true stories, remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the dead of night. And before you go to sleep, remember to check under your bed.